She did not flinch. That was the part no one would have expected, not even herself, when the words came out of his mouth, low and almost casual, the way a man might comment on the weather or the quality of the bread. Something inside her went very still, not numb, still. The way a pond goes still right before it freezes over, when everything underneath is still moving, but the surface gives nothing away. "You've always been plain," Bernard said. "I thought you'd at least make up for it with some grace at the table." He had not raised his voice. He didn't need to. His mother, seated across from her, pressed her lips together in a way that could have been a smile or could have been an attempt to hide one. His sister looked down at her plate. The manservant near the doorway went very still in the way. Only servants learn to go still. Delia set down her spoon. It made the softest sound against the china, a sound so small it should not have mattered. But it did. She picked up her napkin, touched the corners of her mouth, and folded it back across her lap. Then she looked at her husband, not with anger, not with tears, not with any of the things she had been holding in for 14 months, and she looked at him the way you look at something you have finally decided to stop carrying. "Thank you for the supper," she said. She pushed back her chair, rose and walked out of the dining room with her back straight and her hands at her sides. Her name was Cordelia Ashby, and she had come to the Whitmore house 14 months ago as Bernard Whitmore's wife. A fact that had never quite been allowed to feel true. The arrangement had been her father's doing, as these arrangements often were. He had debts. The Whitmores had land. These were the mathematics of her life, and she had been raised to understand them without protest. She was 23 years old. She had been educated carefully. French, music, household management, the precise amount of literature that made a woman conversational without making her inconvenient. She could manage accounts. She could read a contract. She had learned these things in the way you learn to carry something heavy. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she had seen what happened to women who couldn't. Bernard was 31. He was not unkind in the way that some men were unkind. Deliberately, consciously, with a certain pleasure in it. He was unkind the way a man is unkind when he has never been asked to think carefully about the people around him. He moved through rooms the way he moved through decisions. Quickly, without looking back, confident that whatever remained in his wake would sort itself out. His mother, Mrs. Whitmore, a woman called Helena by a small and dwindling number of people who remembered her before she became Mrs. Whitmore, had made her position clear within the first week of the marriage. Bernard married beneath himself, she had told a visitor within Delia's earshot, not bothering to lower her voice. "We all do our best with what circumstances provide." Delia had been arranging flowers in the adjacent room. She had finished arranging them. She had carried them to the drawing room, set them on the table near the window, and gone upstairs to write a letter to her younger sister. She had not cried. She had written the letter in very small, very neat handwriting, and she had not mentioned what she had heard. This was how she had learned to live in the Whitmore house, quietly, carefully, taking up as little space as possible, moving through the days like a guest who had stayed too long and was trying not to remind anyone of her presence. The night Bernard said what he said at the table, Delia did not sleep. She lay in the room that had been assigned to her. Not the room she might have shared with a husband who wanted to share rooms with his wife. And she stared at the ceiling and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, about what she was going to do, not whether. What? She had carried this weight for 14 months. She had carried it without dropping it, without complaining, without asking for anyone's help. She had managed the house accounts when Mrs. Whitmore's methods created confusion. She had smoothed over Bernard's social missteps with quiet precision. She had sat at that table, night after night, and eaten food she had overseen the preparation of, in a house she had learned to run, surrounded by people who spoke of her as though she were a piece of furniture that had come with the property. Plain, he had called her. She thought about that word for a long time in the dark. She turned it over the way you turn over a stone at the edge of a road, to see what lives underneath. And what she found underneath was not hurt, or not only hurt. What she found was something harder and quieter than hurt. Something that had been forming for months without her permission, building up like pressure behind a wall. The wall came down that night. By the time the house went quiet, the last footstep, the last closing door, the last creak of a floorboard settling, Delia had already made her decision. She got up from the bed in the dark. She found her trunk in the closet, the smaller one, the one she had brought from her father's house. She opened it on the floor and she began, very quietly, to fill it. She did not pack everything. She packed what was hers. Not what had been given to her as a wife in this house, but what she had brought with her. The blue wool dress, the practical boots, the leather notebook she wrote in when no one was watching, the small amount of money she had managed to save from the household accounts. Her father had taught her this, had pressed coins into her hand the day before the wedding with a look she hadn't quite understood until now. A few letters, a cameo brooch that had been her grandmother's, her good gloves. She worked in silence. She made no sound that wasn't necessary. At 4 in the morning, when the sky outside was still fully dark, and the house was as quiet as it ever got, Delia Ashby. Not Delia Whitmore, she had decided. She was done with that name. Carried her trunk down the back stairs, through the kitchen, and out the servants' entrance into the cold morning air. She did not leave a note. The town of Grover's Mill was small enough that everyone knew the Whitmore family, and large enough that a woman with a trunk and a straight back and somewhere to be could move through it, without attracting much comment in the early hours. She had written to her Aunt Vera 2 weeks prior. Not asking, informing. Vera Ashby was her father's sister and the only person in the family who had ever looked at Delia's marriage with anything other than relief. She was 61 years old, had been widowed twice, and lived in a small but comfortable house in the next county, where she took in students for music lessons and tolerated no nonsense from anyone. Her letter back had been brief. Come when you need to. The east room has a good window. Delia had read that letter 3 times. She had memorized it. She had kept it in the leather notebook. She hired a cart at the livery stable. A young man named Eli, who asked no questions, and seemed genuinely unbothered by a woman traveling alone at 4:30 in the morning. And she rode through the gray pre-dawn, without looking back at the town where she had been Bernard Whitmore's plain wife for 14 months. The road was long and cold, and she was glad of it. The cold kept her awake. The distance kept her thinking clearly. By the time she arrived at Vera's house, the sun was up, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and something baking. And Vera came to the door before Delia had even knocked, as if she had been listening for the sound of cartwheels. East room has a good window, Vera said again, and stood back to let her in. She had been at Vera's house for 3 weeks. When the letter from the solicitor arrived, she nearly didn't open it. The envelope bore the name Whitmore, and she had made a private agreement with herself not to let the Whitmore name into this house, if she could help it. But the solicitor's name, Fenwick and Associates, Grover's Mill, was one she recognized from her father's papers, and so she opened it. The letter was not about Bernard. It was about her father's mill. She read it twice, and then she sat down because her legs had stopped cooperating with the rest of her. Her father, it appeared, had left the mill jointly, a provision in the original deed she had not known about. A provision her father had never mentioned, possibly because he had not expected to die when he did, or possibly because he had meant to tell her and simply hadn't. The provision specified that the mill property could not be transferred or sold without the signature of all parties named in the deed. One of those parties was Delia. Another, by virtue of a clause she didn't fully understand without a legal dictionary, was Bernard. The mill itself was nothing. The land it sat on was not nothing. There was a developer, someone from the city, the letter said, with money and intentions, who wanted to buy the entire parcel. The offer was considerable. The offer would require both signatures. The offer would expire in 6 weeks. Delia set the letter on Vera's kitchen table. Vera read it across from her, said nothing for a moment, and then said, Well, Delia agreed. You'll have to see him, I know. Do you want to? Delia thought about that. She thought about the dining room and the china and the sound of her spoon being set down. She thought about 14 months of being spoken of like furniture. She thought about Bernard's face. Not when he had said what he said, but after, when she had walked out, when she had looked back from the hallway just once and seen his expression shift in a way she hadn't expected. Not anger. Something closer to confusion, as though the furniture had moved itself and he couldn't account for it. No, she said, but I'll go. She sent word ahead. Not to Bernard, to the solicitor, Mr. Fenwick, who had offices on the main street of Grover's Mill, and who, to his credit, responded promptly and without editorializing. Bernard arrived at the solicitor's office before she did. She saw him from the street, through the window, saw him standing near the bookcase with his hat in his hands, which surprised her. She had never seen him hold his hat in his hands. He was usually the kind of man who put things down on surfaces and expected them to remain where he left them. She went inside. He turned when she entered. The hat stayed in his hands. Delia, he said. She had prepared for this. She had spent 3 weeks preparing for it in the way she prepared for things she didn't want to do, methodically, without allowing herself to feel any of it until there was time for that later. Mr. Fenwick, she said, nodding to the solicitor. Then, because she was not a coward, even when she wanted to be, Bernarder. Fenwick, who had clearly been dreading this meeting, looked between them and cleared his throat and began to explain the situation with the efficient relief of a man who is very glad to have documents to refer to. The documents said what the letter had said. The land could not be sold without both signatures. The developer's offer was attached. It was, as described, considerable. There was a timeline, there were forms. There was a great deal of careful, specific language designed to reduce everything to something manageable. Bernard listened. He asked 2 questions. Good questions, Delia noted despite herself. He had always been better at business than at most other things. Then he was quiet for a moment. "I'd like a word," he said, privately. "If that's—" he glanced at Delia, "if that's acceptable." She looked at him for a long moment. He was still holding the hat. 5 minutes, she said. Mr. Fenwick excused himself with the practiced discretion of a man who has witnessed many difficult conversations and wants to be adjacent to none of them. The office was quiet. Outside, the street sounds of Grover's Mill continued. A cart, someone calling to someone, the ordinary, unremarkable noise of a town going about its business. "You left without a word," Bernard said. He did not say it like an accusation. He said it like a man reading back a fact he is still not sure he believes. "You said what you said at the table," Delia answered. "In front of your family, in front of the help." He didn't look away. She had expected him to. She had prepared for him to. Do you know why I said thank you for the supper and walked out?" He was quiet. "Because I had nothing left to say that you deserved to hear," she said. "Everything I might have said, I had been keeping it somewhere useful, and then there was no point in keeping it anymore." Bernard looked at the hat in his hands. He turned the brim once, slowly. "My mother—" "Don't," Delia said. He looked up. "Don't make this about your mother. You are not 14 years old. You heard what she said about me for 14 months, and you said nothing. And then you sat at your own table, and you said worse. That was your choice, not hers." The silence after that had a different quality than the silence before it. "I know," he said again, and then quietly, "I hadn't thought about how it must have been. Here every day." She looked at him. She looked at him the way she had not allowed herself to look at him in 14 months. Not with hope, or with softness, but with clear eyes, taking stock of what was actually there. He was not a bad man. She had known that from the beginning, and it had made everything harder, not easier. A bad man you could hate cleanly. Bernard Whitmore was a man who had simply never been asked to pay attention, and had never noticed the cost of that inattention, because no one had ever made him see it, until now. "The land," she said finally, "I'll sign, on one condition." His eyes came up. "I want a legal separation, properly drawn up, not a scandal. I'm not interested in a scandal. But a document that says I am not required to return to your house, that I have independent management of my portion of any proceeds from the sale, and that my name, Ashby, not Whitmore, is the name I use going forward." Bernard was quiet for a long time. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had spent 14 months getting good at it. "Is that all?" he finally asked. "That's all." He nodded once, slowly. "All right." She had expected to feel something large when he agreed. Relief, or satisfaction, or the particular hollow feeling of getting what you wanted after wanting it so long that the wanting had become its own kind of company. What she felt instead was something quieter. The easing of a pressure she hadn't realized she'd been bracing against. "I'll have Fenwick draw it up alongside the sale documents," he said. "That would be efficient," she said. He almost smiled at that. It was the closest to real she had seen him look in over a year. "You always were." She didn't answer that. There wasn't anything to answer. The sale took 4 weeks to finalize. During that time, Delia stayed at Vera's house and continued her life there in the careful, practical way she had continued doing things since she arrived, taking stock of what she had, deciding what was worth keeping, letting the rest go. Vera had students on Tuesdays and Thursdays. On those mornings, Delia made herself useful. Not in the way she had been useful in the Whitmore house, invisible and interchangeable, but in the way she had always been useful. Someone actually looked at her and saw what she could do. She organized Vera's filing system, which had not been organized since the previous decade. She wrote letters on Vera's behalf to the music conservatory in the city about a teaching certification. She read. She slept. She woke up in the east room with the good window and watched the light change over the fields and felt, for the first time in longer than she wanted to count, like a person who had some say in the shape of her own days. She also had a visitor, on a Thursday, which she had not expected. Mrs. Helena Whitmore. She came alone, which was the first surprise. She came in a plain carriage, which was the second. She stood at Vera's front door in a dark dress, and did not look comfortable about being there, which was, Delia thought, Probably the most honest thing she had ever seen Bernard's mother look. Vera, to her considerable credit, opened the door, assessed the situation in a single glance, and said, "I'll be in the garden." Delia sat across from Helena Whitmore in the small front room, with its music stands and its student chairs, and she waited. "I know," Helena said finally, "that I have not made things easy for you." Delia looked at her and said nothing. "Bernard told me what you asked for, the separation." Helena's hands were in her lap. They were not entirely still. "I came to tell you. I came to say that I will not interfere with any of it." This was not what Delia had expected. She had expected anger. She had spent several days preparing for anger. "I also came to say," Helena continued, her voice dropping to something less controlled, "that what was said at the table, what he said, I should have stopped it, or said something. I should have. The room was quiet." "You didn't," Delia said. "Not as an accusation. As a fact." "No," Helena agreed. "I didn't." There was a long pause. Delia looked out the window at Vera's garden, where Vera was very determinedly examining a rosebush she had probably already examined 3 times that morning. "I don't know what you want from me, Mrs. Whitmore," Delia said at last. "If you're asking for forgiveness, I can't give you that today. I don't know if I'll give it at all. That's an honest answer." Helena nodded. She looked, in that moment, like a woman who was older than she usually allowed herself to appear. "An honest answer is more than I deserve." She rose to go. At the door she paused. "You managed that house beautifully," she said without turning around. "I never said so. I should have." She left. Delia sat very still for a moment. Then she walked out to the garden, stood next to Vera, and looked at the rosebush with her. "Well," Vera said. "Well," Delia said. They stood there for a while, not saying anything else. It was enough. The separation papers were signed on a Tuesday in late October in the same solicitor's office, with Mr. Fenwick present and no one's hands shaking. Bernard signed first. He slid the papers across to her without ceremony. She signed her name, Cordelia Ashby, in the precise, clear handwriting she had practiced since she was 6 years old, and she felt the pen move across the paper and thought, "There it is. The thing done." The door closed. The window opened. He walked her out onto the street afterward, which she hadn't asked for, but she didn't object. "Will you stay in the county?" he asked. "For now," she said. "Vera needs help with the conservatory correspondence." "I'm good at correspondence." "You're good at everything," he said. "I should have said so. I should have said a great many things I didn't say." She looked at him. The October light was thin and very clear, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been drawn with a fine-pointed pen. He looked, in it, like what he actually was. A man who had been given something valuable and hadn't noticed it until it was gone. Not a villain, not a hero. Just a man standing in the street with the consequences of his inattention, finally paying attention. "Bernard," she said. He waited. "Take care of yourself." She meant it. That was the strange thing. She meant it without malice, and without softness, and without any of the complicated feelings she had expected to feel. She meant it the way you mean something when you've already put it down, and walked away from it, and you can afford to wish it well, because it no longer costs you anything. He nodded. He put his hat back on. She walked down the street in the October light, her coat against the cold, her name back in her own keeping, and she did not look back. That winter, Vera's music conservatory received its certification. Delia ran the administrative correspondence. She was very good at it. She wrote letters that were clear and specific and made things happen, in the way that clear, specific letters reliably make things happen. She filed the documents. She organized the schedule. She negotiated a better rate from the printer in town, who did the conservatory's announcements. She also began teaching, though she hadn't planned on it. One of Vera's younger students had difficulty reading music, and Delia, who had learned to read music the same way she had learned everything else, by working at it until it made sense, sat down with the girl one afternoon, and by the end of it the girl could hear the difference between a quarter note and a half note. The girl told her mother. The mother told 2 other mothers. By January, Delia had 3 students of her own. She was not unhappy. She was, more precisely, not in pain. This was a different thing from happiness, and she knew the difference. And she was content to let the difference stand for now. There were days that felt something close to good. Mornings with the East Room window light. Evenings with Vera playing slowly through something complicated while the fire worked away at the wood. And these days accumulated without drama, without anyone remarking on them. Until one day she noticed she had stopped measuring time by how far away she was from the Whitmore house, and started measuring it by what was ahead. In February, a letter arrived from Bernard. She opened it without particular dread. She had reached a point where the Whitmore name no longer made her brace against something. The letter was brief. He had sold the remainder of the estate holdings. Not all of them, but the outlying parcels. He had accepted a position managing an investment firm in the city. He was moving, in other words, into a life better suited to what he actually was, a man good at business, better without a household to neglect. He wished her well. He hoped she was this was the word he used, flourishing. She read the word twice. She wasn't sure, yet, that flourishing was the right word for what she was doing. But she thought it might get there. She thought it was not an unreasonable destination. She wrote back. The letter was short and courteous and genuine. She wished him well in the city. She told him about the conservatory certification. She signed it Cordelia Ashby, in the precise, clear handwriting, and she sealed it and sent it off and went back to her desk, where 3 letters waited to be written on behalf of the conservatory, and a student's music exercise needed correcting, and Vera had left a cup of tea at her elbow that was still warm. Outside the east room window, the February light was thin and exact, the kind that makes promises it can't quite yet keep about the spring. She picked up her pen. She had work to do.